This evening we have the problem of the miracle as a proof of faith. And perhaps we do not all realize just exactly the magnitude of this equation. The determination of the validity of the miraculous is probably one of the most challenging and immense in implications of all the problems that concern us in life. Therefore, we must first analyze this problem of the miracle itself and realize also that there is a long, rather complicated background to the entire concept. Essentially, we think of a miracle as an event or a circumstance that is contrary to the normal operations of nature or the universe. The miracle constitutes an effect, the cause of which is either so remote or so totally unfamiliar to our consciousness that it cannot be fitted into our accepted pattern of life. We do not want to enter into the long and detailed controversy as to whether or not the miracle per se is actually a fact. I'm inclined to follow the broad school of idealism that assumes that these peculiar, remarkable occurrences, testified to by most of the sacred writings of the world, and attributed to many sanctified persons, and to ordinary persons under extraordinary conditions, that this long record cannot be regarded as merely an hallucination. Therefore, I would have a tendency to side with William James on this, in the assumption that the miracle presents something to us, perhaps a refutation of the smugness of our own small way of thinking, perhaps a reminder that we have not exhausted our own knowledge of universal law, perhaps even more reminding us that we live in a world of many dimensions, some of which are as yet unknown to us. It seems the greater part of modesty to assume that our own ignorance results in the curious group of circumstances which we regard as miraculous. Perhaps then we may side with Paracelsus, who defined the miracle as an effect, the cause of which is unknown, but which unknown cause must be in itself equal to the effect which it produces. That miracle, therefore, stands for the validity of unknown cause. Now, this subject has taken considerable hold on popular thinking in the last 25 years, and there has been a steady drift away from the utterly materialistic attitude that the miracle was either an hallucination or merely a psychological phenomenon. The belief in the doctrine of evolution, as it gradually developed in the period following the pioneering work of Darwin and Huxley, rather than detracting from the miracle, gave it a certain scientific standing. Evolution forced upon man the realization that he was an incomplete creature, unfolding through a universe which might be complete, but which might also be incomplete. Therefore, that man and the universe are both growing. growth inevitably implies the existence of a state superior to the known. And growth furthermore implies that man cannot afford to take final attitudes as long as he remains a finite creature, capable of knowing more tomorrow than he knows today. The miracle was therefore more or less included among those things about which man might ultimately know more. And that therefore, that it is quite within reason that the miracle, as we call it, is a lawful incident, and is not, as some psychologists now affirm, that it is an acausal circumstance. We are better in a position to say that it is a circumstance the cause of which we do not comprehend. Now, in a strange and wonderful way, we divide the miraculous from the everyday. Yet, as Lord Bacon pointed out, it is not necessary for God to continually resort to miracles, inasmuch as his common works are in themselves miraculous. In this we have the concept that if we wish to be exceedingly literal, if we wish to claim a very cool and calculating reason, we must admit that nearly everything which is important to us in life involves elements not explainable by man. The very existence of man himself is miraculous. The origin of the thoughts that come into his mind is miraculous. The achievements which the human being is capable of engendering out of his own resources are miraculous. We live in a world of effects, or perhaps effects and secondary causes, but we are unequipped to deal or contemplate original causes. Therefore, all things, common and daily known, if we continue to examine them, retire gradually from our perception until their roots and sources are in an unknown. The miracle, therefore, in some way relates to the relationship between the unknown and the known, between things which can be explained by the knowledge we presently possess, and other things which are inexplicable in the terms of what we are able to know and understand. Nearly every religious system of the world has recorded miracles, and this has caused the rise of certain theological thinking relating to this subject. One of these schools of thought has investigated the place of the miracle in Revelation. In other words, why is the miracle so consistently present in the lives of religious teachers, or so reported? Is this miracle a proof of the divine ministry or mission of that person? Does the power to work a miracle substantiate the claim to the presence of divine power? There have been several schools of thought on this subject, some taking the statement very directly that the power to work a miracle is the proof of the presence of a divine agency. Another school takes the attitude that the miracle is not the proof, but is to a degree the substantiation of that which is already demonstrated by religion, by faith, and by doctrine. It is a consummating evidence but not a proof. In the world of modern science, the trend was long away from the miraculous. It became fashionable to doubt all things. But in recent years, even the scientist has changed a great many of his basic attitudes. Today, the miracle is not regarded as entirely outside the sphere of science. In fact, the scientific man is beginning to suspect that the miracle bears evidence to operations in nature which have not yet been explored, perhaps because of previous conviction about miracles, namely that because they were the direct work of God, they could not be explained, and partly because of man's willingness to accept without doubt or question certain things which were evidently and obviously to his benefit. The modern religious world, particularly Christendom, is profoundly moved by the account of miracles contained in the New Testament. And while many miraculous happenings are discounted, the miracles of Jesus have generally been accepted as presence or evidence of some intercessional factor in nature. The miracle, again, depends somewhat upon our concept of God, and thus the miracle moves very directly into the deepest parts of our concept and belief. The miracle can sustain, to many persons, and does, the belief in the existence of a personal deity, because it seems that only a personal deity would be capable of performing a series of personal and special or particular miracles. Thus prayer and other religious rites and exercises are assumed to give man a certain sharing in the miraculous power of God. This brings the rationalists and the philosophers into the picture with the simple question, what are the miraculous powers of God? Not long ago, a man was approached in one of our communities by the representative of a local church. This man was being questioned because the visiting clergyman wanted to decide whether this man should be a member of his congregation. And in the course of the discussion, the minister said to the would-be convert, do you believe in miracles? And the man said no. So the minister was immediately duly shocked and expressed himself quite fully. He said, well, how do you expect to be a good member of our congregation if you don't believe in miracles, particularly the miracles of Christ? Man said, Doctor, I think you're the one that is wrong. Because it says in the good book, with God, all things are possible. If that is true, there cannot be a miracle. Because we are in the presence of a being who can do anything. And a being who can do anything cannot do anything miraculous. Because the fact that he can do anything makes anything his normal and natural work, not a miracle. Well, that was a little too much for the clergyman. He went home to think it over. And as far as I've been able to learn, he has not decided to include my friend in the congregation. Well, now there's a fine point of reasoning here. If we assume that with the divine power all things are possible, we must also assume that as this power is divine, and that there can be no recourse beyond it, and that by its own divinity it establishes all things in lawfulness, then we must assume that all the works of this power are lawful, and that these works must therefore have their causes, either in the mind of God or in the will of God. Therefore they are not acausal or without cause. Also, if with this divine power all things are possible, then we may naturally ask, why are some things made evident and others not? If deity is capable of the infinite expression of its own will and purpose throughout all time and throughout all space, why then is the miraculous the comparative exception to the rule? Is it an exception to the rule? And if it is an exception, what are the exceptional circumstances by which it is an exception? Now we observe that in most instances, the miraculous is associated with certain conditions, which are themselves different from ordinary conditions, or with persons that are different from ordinary persons, or under critical conditions which are different from ordinary conditions. Therefore, the miracle not only has its causal root, according to this school of thinking, in the divine nature, but it has a certain secondary cause. And this secondary cause is an arrangement, a pattern, a design or formation of some kind in the sphere of creation, by means of which the Creator, the creation, and the creature come into a new patternal association with each other. That might seem a little confusing, and it is, but if we think a little, we are forced to assume that miracles do not occur always, everywhere. They do not occur even when they are often most besought. And even in the great shrines of healing, as Lourdes, all are not healed. Therefore we come into another situation, which implies that if the miraculous arises in the fact that with God all things are possible, then we also recognize that all possibility is not everywhere made evident or made manifest. And we come to another equally important parallel. In the scriptures we are told that man is made in the image of his God. Yet we cannot say that this is always obviously true. We are assured that within God, man lives and moves and has his being. And yet man is not totally godly, nor are his works always godly. And as Omar points out, this sovereign power, creator of all things, with paradise devised the snake. All things, therefore, do not inevitably move in patterns fulfilling the divine will. If, therefore, all things with God are possible, why are not some good things ever manifested, and other ill things forever frustrated? There must be, then, other factors beside the power of God to perform what we regard as the impossible. The miracle must then depend upon more than the eternal availability of the divine presence or the divine power. Things available and things accepted may be two different things. And between the power of God, and the natural destiny of men, something else is interposed. Something which becomes a limitation, or an apparent limitation, upon the eternal availability of the Spirit. This thing that seems to come in between has always been identified with the principle of mind, or the human being's inalienable right to self-determinism. Now, the Church for a long time struggled with the power of the individual in relationship to the cosmic pattern. Yet it had to face the symbolism of initial disobedience. It had to cope with the problem of the fall of man, as in ecclesiastical thinking. And in a more common daily way, it had to cope with the fact that the human being, the child of the infinite, fashioned in the likeness of God and with God within himself as his living and motive power, this human being acted in an ungodly manner. The philosopher, therefore, assumes that one of the divine powers, eternally inherent in deity, the very power by which we may say that with God all things are possible, this power exists in shadow, reflection, or degree in man, causing man to say, with me all things are possible. Man is capable, then, of an intellectual individuality. He is capable of attaining to a degree of self-will, in which he is not inevitably and immediately compelled to obedience, either with the will of God or the law of nature. Our early philosopher mystics coped with the problem of the parallel between the will of God and the law of nature, assuming that the laws of nature are the extension of the will of God into the sphere of form, that these laws are therefore in their root identical with the divine laws, and that wherever we meet or experience the presence of a principle of law and order, we are also in the presence of the God will in that thing. Now, Aquinas and some other theologians supposed or argued the possibility of there being laws in matter, contrary to the laws of God. But to most mystics, this would seem more miraculous than the miracle itself, because as nature represents an inferior state suspended from a superior principle, it is inconceivable that the creation should possess principles and essences essentially in conflict with the Creator. Therefore, perhaps Plato and some of the philosophers came nearer to the fact, namely that matter is not a substance contrary to God, but that matter is a degree of density in which energies and forces are apparently diminished, and that the free action of energy is impeded, and that therefore energies which in their free state are able to accomplish many things, in this imprisoned state are subjected to the rules and patterns of matter and organization, and therefore that the divine power moving into material expression must move through the channels of form, restricted and directed by these channels, not essentially altered in substance, but certainly diminished in immediate availability at any time or under any circumstance. Thus, the problem of the nature of the adversary or the opposing power Gradually in the minds of philosophy, Eastern and Western, ended in the assumption or led to the conclusion that the human mind is an instrument capable of self-assertion, capable of an immediate rebellion against the principles of the world in which it lived. The mind cannot rebel against God, but the mind can rebel against the limitations and restrictions of form. The reason being obvious, namely, that no inferior can rebel against its superior. Mind, being less than God, cannot hope to achieve a rebellion against God. But mind is superior to matter. Therefore, mind can rebel against material limitation, and in so doing rebels against those phases of universal procedure which have been incorporated in form and are known to man only as the laws of nature. Man has therefore long been at variance with nature, even while he was claiming obedience to God. He has distinguished between God and nature, considering them as polarized opposites, whereas in substance, nature is merely the manifestation of deity on one of the innumerable levels of creation. Man, having a mental center within his own nature, due to circumstances which are too long and involved for us to try to include them in the present discussion, man has the capacity within himself of obedience through wisdom and disobedience through ignorance. This summarizes his state. In those things about which he has knowledge, he may choose to do that which is true. And believe it or not, he generally does. That is the amazing thing. When we say of an individual, he believes one thing and acts in a contrary manner, we are only saying that he holds two states of mind. Actually, what he truly and basically believes, he does, because there can be no instinct contrary to the full conviction of his own inner life. The trouble is that he holds certain good attitudes, not by true belief, but by intellectual acceptance alone, and therefore they are not vital enough to sustain him in the conflict of ideas. If man, then, has the capacity of not knowing certain things, he also has the capacity of not doing certain things, and also of doing certain other things out of unknowing rather than out of certainty. The result is confusion. The result is chaos. All of these processes in man bring us back to Buddha's original statement that ignorance is the original disease. All other disease is dependent upon it. It is ignorance primarily that is the root of spiritual, mental, emotional, moral, ethical, and physical sickness. And ignorance is not lack of knowledge on the level of science. Ignorance is lack of knowledge on the level of reality, on the level of things as they inevitably and actually are. By this thinking, sickness is essentially due to man's variance from things as they are. Sickness must come from maladjustment between the individual and the archetypal pattern of his kind. Man is never punished for obedience. He is punished for disobedience. He is never hurt or injured because he is moving with truth, but because he is moving contrary to it or not moving at all. Where man does not move, motion moves past him and through him, creating friction and destruction. Where man moves contrary to law, he receives the pressure of law upon himself. And because of this circumstance, he is gradually overwhelmed or destroyed by inevitables and irresistibles with which he does not cooperate. This brings us then to the problem of sickness in relationship to the God concept of antiquity. Namely, that God cannot be the cause of sickness. And the old mystic philosophers were quite obviously consistent when they added the next inevitable truism, namely that in the life of man, for which God is not the cause, man must be the cause. Therefore, sickness represents a breaking of rules, a breaking of patterns. And because in most instances these patterns are broken through ignorance, the individual is not aware of his own action or its consequences until he performs it. This is not universally true, however, because many individuals consciously and knowingly break laws, and in so doing also bring sorrow and sickness and death, unnecessarily or prematurely upon themselves. If deity represents then reality, the presence of deity in all things is manifested by the reality in those things. And whatever obscures this reality obscures God and also obscures help. So we find the person suffering from innumerable difficulties. And we observe that he gradually creates a science or an art. The art of healing, or the science of medicine, with which he attempts to combat the various symptoms of disobedience which exist within his own nature. Now these symptoms sometimes bear witness to trivial things, sometimes to greater things. And man has been able to correct or to neutralize a great many of the effects of his own disobedience. But until he corrects disobedience in itself, he can never prevent the recurrence of the maladies or ailments from which he suffers. His capacity to disobey must always be attended by its natural consequence, punishment for disobedience. Now all this perhaps prepares us a little bit to consider the nature of the miracle. And I think that this type of thinking on it comes as close to the idealistic position as can be found in the great systems of ethics with which we are concerned. Reality is ever present. Reality is the sum total of all things. Unreality can never equal it nor exceed it. And therefore, unreality is a passing mood or condition due to the obscuration of the human intellect. Reality in itself is not only omniscient and omnipresent, but omniactive in the life of every living creature. In man, therefore, at all time, from the beginning of his existence till the end, there must be a hard core of reality, because it is this core which gives him life. He lives because of a reality. He lives badly because of an unreality. But that he exists, that he has a self-moving principle within him, that he participates in the universal energies which sustain all living things, These testify to man as an actuality, to man as a being, through whose construction universal energies can and must move for his survival. If, therefore, this core of reality exists within man, what lies between man and this reality? And we like to think, in general, simple, broad terms, that this veil, this covering, this mask, this obscuration which conceals reality is individuality, or perhaps even personality. That because the individual is an individual, he has lost his immediate apperception of universals. The human mind is incapable of the experience of universal. If it was capable of such experience, it would then be in the position to utilize the infinite potentials of life. Instead of that, man is limited by his faculties, by his powers, by his structure. He is limited environmentally by conditions, the time in which he lives, the race to which he belongs, the religion which he follows. In all these ways, he is gradually specialized into a limited creature. And in this limitation, the core of actuality within himself is obscured, is locked, is held in abeyance, and man uses his available energy not for purpose, but for a purpose. He drains off his resources in the attainment of particular ends, these purposes which he particularly wishes to advance. Such energies as cannot be applied to these purposes are therefore not used at all, and the individual is locked within a structure consisting of perceptions and sensations and dominated by attitudes which determine the uses which he will make of energy. Thus man cannot even experience the concept of a total use of energy. He can experience only partial usages. He gets up in the morning, uses a certain amount of energy getting dressed. He uses some more energy eating his food. He uses more energy getting to work. He uses still more energy in his work. He then returns and uses energy in other ways and finally rests in order to recuperate his available supply of these energies. Yet man would be the first to admit in most cases that there are energies which he does not use. And in each walk of life that we follow, there are energies that we do not use. The individual performing manual labor may not use his mental energies. The musician, under some conditions, may not use either his mental nor his physical energies, depending almost entirely upon his emotional energies for expression, with some physical assistance. The intellectualist may not use his physical energies to any great degree by living a sedentary life. Thus each individual uses certain energies. Those which he does not use become less and less available to him, until the intellectual finds physical exertion ever more difficult. Yet in addition to all these energies that he uses, are others with which he is comparatively unfamiliar, as intuitive energies, inspirational energies, energies on the ESP level, energies relating to the sheer dynamic of creativity. These energies are used by only a very small number of persons. Thus, we have never yet conceived of the full area of energy, nor have we conceived what might happen if man's total field of energy was released simultaneously. It is inconceivable that it could be. In all probabilities, if it was, it would shatter man completely, because he is using energies highly channeled, highly modified, and highly restricted by the bodily functions through which they manifest. Now in sickness, usually, we have a marked depletion of energies. This depletion is due either to exhaustion or to the presence of obstruction in the system, or to a general state of toxicity, or the rising in the system of substances, waste materials, and the like, which prevent or restrict the normal activity of the person and make it ever more difficult for his internal mechanism to respond to the instincts and impulses of the energy fields within him. Thus he blocks or obscures, and through the crystallization of age, this is further exaggerated. Also, the individual in one way or another, through the unreasonable or unwise conduct of his living, depletes not only his energies, but the methods by which energy may be accumulated, sustained, or increased within the structure. Now let us take a special consideration for this, because it might immediately get us into an apparent contradiction if we do not. Man has a total energy which is termed the core of reality. Man also has a series of bodies in which special energy fields derived from their corresponding energy fields in the world around him derive also their nutrition. Therefore, man's core energy, his eternal life principle, abiding in its own world, is particularly and obviously known to man only because of its causal pressure upon him. Man's thinking is due to another kind or level of energy, mental energy, which is a kind of electricity available in space, and which sustains, nourishes, supports all intellectual activity in any creature possessing it. Man also has a field of emotional energy, corresponding to the emotional energy of his planet, or the kind, limit, or quality of electrical energy, which peculiarly and inevitably manifests as emotional force or power. Man also has vital energy, derived principally from the sun and from the etheric plane of the world around him, a kind of free energy which contributes particularly to processes of growth and reconstruction. Then he has physical energy, derived largely from the earth and supported by nutrition, respiration, and some other sources. Now each of these planes of energy sustains the function and structure of an organization or body. And each of these bodies is useful to superior vehicles or superior purposes only because it is a functioning instrument in itself. We can use the radio as an example. The sending station sends a program. The receiving set receives the program. But to receive the program, the receiving set must either be plugged into an electric circuit or else have a battery. In other words, the receiving set, in order to receive, must have its own field of energy. Now in the body, the physical body, in order to receive vitality and energy from the superior parts of itself, or to transmit and externalize man's spiritual, intellectual, and emotional forces, must have an energy field of its own, because transmission is on the level of energies, not on the level of physical substances. If, therefore, for any reason, man's nutritional field breaks down, or his physical energies are obscured or obstructed, or are exhausted, immediately the ties between the physical energy fields and the higher energy fields are distorted, and the functions of higher energies through their physical instruments in the body, these functions are also distorted, injured, or caused to depart from their natural processes. Man, therefore, in order to function on the objective plane as an integrated person, must have an energy field surrounding and interpenetrating his physical body, which acts as a catalyst for these other higher energy fields which must be associated with the body and must broadcast their messages to the body through these energy media. It follows, of course, that as these become for one reason or another injured or corrupted, that man apparently loses the powers represented by these superior energy fields. Thus, if the brain is injured, we assume that the mind is injured, when actually it is not the mind, it is only the brain, which is no longer able to support through its energy field the subtle transmissions from the mental instrument in man or of man. When we say the emotions are deranged, we mean that the emotional centers in the physical body are unable to properly transmit the emotional impulses of man himself, the same of his vital impulses, and also of his physical impulses. We have no evidence or proof that these superior vehicles as mind in emotion are of themselves naturally or internally deformed or injured. We cannot know and do not know that the mind of the human being fails because, for instance, in age, the physical brain exhibits senility. We merely realize that the mental energy is gradually unable to manifest itself through a crystallizing or injured or diseased physical organism. Thus, by degrees, we conceive of man as a series of bodies, each of which has its own energy allotments, and these bodies, focusing upon the material body, result in the objective manifestation of man as we see him, a being in which a number of different levels of energy are manifested constantly in the various activities of daily living. One group of energies in speaking, another group of energies in thinking, another group of energies in physical activity. And these energies all move from their proper levels into the constitution of man through the great centers of energy within his physical body. Energy itself is never identical with matter, although it is impossible to completely disassociate them. We are unaware of the existence of matter without energy, but we are equally unaware of the existence of energy without matter. Energy without matter, moving freely in space, is beyond our cognition. Matter without energy is a state of inertia beyond our comprehension, because at this point, where energy fails in matter, matter ceases to be knowable to us. Because the moment energy fails totally in matter, the compounds which we call matter are dissolved. For one of the basic uses or manifestations of energy is that energy holds material elements in patterns. These patterns alone we can see. Neither the elements nor the energies are visible to us. Therefore, everything that we see is a compound of energy and matter. And whether it is the physical body or a thought, It is a compound of a kind of energy and a kind of matter. The highest form of matter that we know is mind, but we undoubtedly suspect correctly the existence of higher forms of matter. The highest form of energy that we can experience generally is intellectual energy, but we have an occasional experience which suggests the existence of a superior energy which we broadly and totally term spiritual. Now, man being thus compounded, we observe that in the normal function of his compound, the spiritual factor is not directly, obviously present. The spiritual factor in man is the causal factor behind himself. And once this causal factor has given the initial impulse, the logos, or the word of St. Paul, in the beginning was the Word. And it seems that this word is the initial vibratory chord struck by absolute energy or reality energy in man. Once, therefore, this energy has said, "Let there be man," this energy then disappears from our awareness. For that reason, and because of its recondite nature, man is unaware of the circumstances which led to his own being. He is unable to explain himself, the reason for himself, the motive behind himself. He is unable to explain the most mysterious of all miraculous circumstances, namely, that he and with him creation itself should exist. There is nothing more incredible, and yet it is. Once this great creative chord, this fiat, has been sounded, causal energy, or total energy, seemingly returns or retires into its own essential nature, and there it remains. Man, searching for it, searches with the energies available to him, and the highest energies that are available to him in daily use are his emotional and mental energies. Therefore, with the emotional energy, he seeks to feel or to experience that which is superior. Through his mental energy, he seeks to rationalize or to discover, through pure cognition, the nature and substance of that which is superior. In both processes, he is inadequate, and all that he can possibly achieve is a certain symbolical definition, because he is not able to actually know or experience the fact. Now, causal energy, or if we wish to call it essential being, gives us quite a serious matter for discussion, and perhaps one of the best expositions of this fact, or this problem, has been given to us through Buddha. Buddha was accused of teaching annihilation, namely, that man, having overcome individual existence, simply ceased. Buddha affirms, however, constantly in his actual teachings that this is not his intention. What Buddha calls nirvana, or essential being, or in his concept more correctly perhaps, essential becoming, consists of that causal energy which cannot be defined, and the total expression of which depends upon the release or removal of all limitation to its own nature. Assuming that man is like a lantern, the glass of which is variously discolored, Buddha would take the attitude that if we could completely clean the lantern, if we could remove all the dirt, then the true light would inevitably remain and be obvious. We cannot increase this light, but what appears to be the increasing of it is actually the cleansing of the lamp, the cleaning away of that which is not so. Therefore, Buddha conceived of the concept that this core of reality, which exists within the individual, is not only the end of his search for truth, it is the solution to his quest for release from suffering. Suffering, whether it be of the body, the soul, or the mind, represents a distemper, an unnatural and unreasonable state. And this unreasonable state is not inevitable. It is not conclusive. It is something which can be corrected or can be changed, so that man can attain to a state of utter reasonableness, or utter conformity and identity with his own total resource. Now, whenever man approaches this, he has the strange and mysterious feeling that it is approaching him. The individual, instead of recognizing that growth is leading him home, seems to take the attitude that as he proceeds through life, home looms nearer. He senses, for instance, God approaching him, as Paul sensed the Master on the road to Damascus. Actually, however, this approaching of totality is the result of the diminishing of unreality in the compound which we call man. Now then we come from this point to the recognition of what we call the miracle. And we're back now to our miracle. What is the type of miracle with which the individual is immediately concerned? The miracle nearly always involves two things, or one of them. The availability of that which is not available normally, or the removal of that which for one reason or another cannot be normally removed. Thus, in the miracle of Jesus, we have the miracle of healing, which may either be the availability of the healing agent or the removal of the obstructing and negating circumstances which cause sickness. Buddha pointed out, as most of the great ones have, that man's relation to reality is a matter of consciousness, and that this relation to reality, whether man knows it or not, is always changing according to the moods and modes of his own integration. Thus, when man, through a circumstance or a condition, sets up a pattern in which an additional release of energy from one of its natural levels is made possible, the individual experiences the transformation that is due to the release of this energy. Thus, for example, we will say that the individual is sick with some particular ailment, some condition that is due actually to ignorance or to obstruction or to damage upon a level of his understanding or nature. We are coming more and more to realize that man's psychic life controls not only functional ailments, but also to a very large degree so-called organic or basic ailments. The so-called great organic, factual diseases of mankind are also psychosomatic. They merely represent larger and deeper psychological patterns than those which are expressed through functional ailments. Therefore, we may say that as an individual on Monday may lose his temper and on Tuesday he may have a stomachache, we can say that this would relate to his functional disorders. But when we say that an individual has been selfish all his life, we are then getting very close to a cause for what we would call organic illness. We've got a bigger, deeper, and stronger habitual pattern, and there is nothing in nature in the form of a cause which will not produce an effect. A man setting up temperamental causation within himself will inevitably so channel energy or so inhibit it that he will inevitably have these results. Studying man as a psychic being rather than a physical being, we observe, therefore, that his emotional and mental excesses pollute the energy reservoirs from which the vital forces necessary for his physical economy are derived. If these are contaminated invisibly in the mental or emotional spheres, this contamination will ultimately disease his body. Diseases, therefore, are not essentially of the body, but through the body. But once they have reached a certain degree, they result in bodily changes and transformations and deteriorations, which may no longer be easily corrected. But just as disease comes through the body as the result of these energy forms that have been distorted by misdirected usage of psychic values, we come upon another important definitional thought, namely that sickness is the result of habitual attitudes. In other words, illness, sickness, suffering are for the most part the results of habits. And these habits, in turn, are continuous or recurrent processes in which the processes themselves become so powerful that the inclination of the human being to change them becomes correspondingly less until it may cease entirely. If then we have habits which cause sickness, we can also cultivate, if we so desire, habits that cause health. Actually, the habit of right thinking is no more difficult to attain than the habit of wrong thinking. Yet in every instance, man has a sense of greater burden in doing that which is right. This is largely due to the fact that his negative habits are long held, and his constructive ones are new and unfamiliar to him. Affirming, however, that habits, which represent archetypal forms in the levels of energies, ultimately express themselves through the body, and through various changes and distortions in the energy fields, we also know that man is a compound being with many qualities. We know that in the constant rearrangement and organization of his patterns, an innumerable array of effects are produced. Some of these effects are pleasant to him, some are unpleasant to him. Some he recognizes, others pass unnoticed. But these patterns continue and are forever changing as a result of a psychic chemistry within his own organization. Thus, behind man as we see him is an elaborate structure, a structure of which we may say, almost as we say of God, all things are possible. And what we've commonly referred to as a miracle or a miraculous circumstance results from a new arrangement arising within the subjective energy fields and their relationship to the body, by means of which some force previously unavailable, some condition previously unjustified, becomes available and reasonable because of causes that have been set in motion. In ancient religious thought, from the very earliest time, the concept of faith has been directly and immediately associated with miracle. We have discussed something of this in the last discussion, so we will only carry a few points and then go on. Namely, that faith, for the most part, becomes a counteracting force to what we call stubbornness. Faith opens just as surely as doubt or fear locks. Fear is one of the most paralyzing of all emotions. And in the magnetic fields of the body, fear locks everything. The entire emotional field closes almost like a sensitive plant that has been touched. Everything available under fear rushes to the protection of instinct. And we observe even that under a great fear, for example, that the individual becomes physically cold. He has the chill of terror, which means essentially that nature has instinctively gathered all of his resources to the protection of the vital centers of his body. To meet the challenge of fear, nature will also discharge into the system adrenaline and certain other endocrine secretions for the purpose of neutralizing or correcting this condition and giving the individual temporary assistance in reorienting his optimism. But fear locks and blocks all things. And the difference between what we might term constructive and destructive thoughts and emotions is almost totally a difference based upon their effect upon the energy fields. Every negative emotion or thought is destructive to the distribution of energy. A thing is not good or bad for man because it is written in a book that way, or because it is included or not included in the Decalogue. Things are good or bad for man primarily because of what they do to him. And all negative things which affect the individual restrict the natural distribution of energy. Each kind of action, however, involves a different compound of thought and emotion, because there is no fear that does not have a certain structure within it, a specializing kind of fear. There is no worry that is just plain worry. Worry is always a compound of emotions. There is no bitterness that does not have a pattern or a design within its own nature. These things are negative psychic compounds, and therefore, like the compounds of medicine which we use for treating disease, the compound that causes the ailment is also a highly specialized thing. Thus, all fears do not produce the same kinds of tension in the body, nor do they affect inevitably the same organs of the body. Fears are sometimes partly mental, partly emotional, sometimes almost totally emotional, sometimes largely mental. Thus, fears, anxieties, doubts, hatreds, all these things, by means of which we achieve a state of isolation from good, these all build barriers to the flow of life force through the body. On the other hand, such things as are highly constructive often result in extraordinary releases of energy. But here again we can get into trouble. Our happiest and most delightful emotions and thoughts can likewise be excessive. And by excess, they can also contribute to the exhaustion of function. Consequently, most of the things that we enjoy, we overdo and come to another series of difficulties through the exhaustion or extravagance of our attitudes. This is undoubtedly the therapeutic foundation for the Socratic recommendation for moderation. Also, most of the emotions and thoughts that we have on a constructive level are of compounds arising from a variety of factors. Very often they arise from the similar types of compounds as our negative or difficult emotions and thoughts. But by a different acceptance or a different interpretation, that which is pleasing to one person is displeasing to another. Searching, therefore, to find, if possible, the most therapeutic, the most vitally helpful of attitudes that the human being can take. Antiquity, and for that matter modernity also, has come upon the peculiar attitude or the remarkable feeling that we have, which is called faith. Now we have to analyze faith a little. Faith is said to be the conviction or the belief in the reality of good things unseen, or on the availability of things hoped for. Faith can have all kinds of levels of expression, but it is one of the feelings in man which is not particularly dependent upon externals for its consequences. Man can have a great and beautiful faith in that which is untrue. He can be benefited by his faith, and he will not be injured by that which is untrue. Faith has about it also a strangely pacifying, relaxing emotion. Man has discovered that faith has to be a more or less receptive attitude. Man cannot begin any experience of faith by certainty. He must begin by hope. He must begin by the assumption of that to be true, which he most devoutly believes must be true. But he cannot have an arrogant faith. He cannot have a faith that is both true and selfish. Faith for man gradually becomes the complete simplification of nearly every process that goes into his emotional and intellectual structure. And on a level of religion, faith for man is his acceptance of the reality of a power greater than himself. It is his acceptance of the reality of this causal core of reality in his own nature. Faith, then, has a tendency to break down pressures, tensions, and excesses in the entire group of magnetic fields. The experience of faith simply organizes things back into their natural relationships. Faith is not pressured by predetermination. Faith is not forced by selfishness or self-seeking, nor can it practice its own way with most of the egoism with which man is daily confronted. Thus, faith is a kind of a relaxation toward reality. It is the individual's simple conviction in the reality and availability of a power greater than himself. It is a shifting, therefore, of his center of awareness from his own ego to the divine being. If man can attain this faith, not upon his lips, not in his mind, not even in his emotions alone, but can have the total experience of faith in his being, a faith rooted in a gradually increasing conviction, this faith in itself makes available to him a tremendous amount of energy not otherwise available. It also relieves him of the pressure of this chain of personality instruments which normally and usually dominate his life. Therefore, Buddha said in one of his discourses that it is perfectly possible, under the discipline of the meditational or contemplative life, for the individual to break the entire cycle of life in a single embodiment. He said it is possible. He did not say that it was easy, or that it would be likely to be done. But theoretically, if man has the resource for the transcendent state of release, the one and total step to reality, a step taken in the full realization of its magnitude, and a step which is a total renunciation of illusion. If theoretically or factually the being is capable of this step, it is capable of immediate identification with reality, because reality is everywhere. No further from any individual than the interval in his own consciousness between illusion and truth. Though under certain conditions man experiences degrees of this. One degree is described as a mystical experience, which is the internal apperception of the law, of the reason for things, which in itself immediately overcomes or overwhelms doubt. And as doubt is antithetical to faith, doubt is a negative emotion. Doubt is one of these things that locks and binds and ties and restricts, and later cankers, and can cause all kinds of difficulties to arise. In the life of man, therefore, the individual in whom what we term the miracle nearly always occurs is the one who has reached the end of his rope. It almost inevitably comes to the person who has been forced to admit one of several things. To the sick, who is forced to admit that the physician cannot cure him, perhaps with the will, consent, and agreement of the physician who admits that he cannot. Another problem is an emergency, in which every condition by which man is accustomed to meet emergency has proved to be ineffective. The individual who is totally at the end of his resources in some way, the individual may not necessarily be thus poor. He may be rich and miserable, but he is at the end of his resources. He has reached the point where he cannot continue as he is. And as a result of that, a decision of some kind has to arise within his own nature. A decision which must imply and must involve a major change in his perspective. It may occur for many reasons. We can't attempt to list them all. But we know that faith arises to its greatest strength in man in emergency. And also that where faith cannot come to man's aid in an emergency, because that man is locked against it, then man experiences his keenest and deepest despair. These two oppositions are inevitable. In these moments of complete emergency, what does man actually do? In most instances, he stands face to face for the first time in his life with the recognition of his own insufficiency. Up to that time, he could talk his way, bluff his way, buy his way, sell his way in and out of the things that he desired or did not desire. Or in the presence of some tribulation, he was able to look around him and find something of a compensating nature. Yes, he had a very unpleasant winter, but it did prove profitable and he got a new car. Therefore, all was forgiven. But when the individual looking around himself for the consolations which compensate for his misery finds no consolation either, he is gradually driven to the point of helplessness. Like the exhausted swimmer, he is reconciled to the fact that he must either drown or the miracle must happen. Now, generally speaking, the miracle happens in a kind of strange compensation for drowning. Because the miracle in some way is the saving factor or the release which comes to the individual when he ceases the struggle to survive. The miracle is therefore a kind of an associate of extreme unction. And it is in these extremities that the individual usually most clearly distinguishes values. If you do not believe that, think back to some time when you were quite sick. And there was a nip and tuck there for a minute. You're not sure whether you were going to make it or not. If you were a normal person, you had certain experiences in that period which should be rather unforgettable. But unfortunately, experiences which you could not convey to anyone else, which has caused some philosophers to say that the greatest instruction in the world for man is one good sickness. And it is, in many instances. This sickness, however, seldom fulfills its major end unless it brings us very close to transition. We experience something that otherwise we might never know. Something that in good health would seem impossible to us. And one of the things that we experience is indifference. We become tremendously indifferent to things we thought we could never bear to ignore or lose. It suddenly becomes very unimportant to us whether stocks go up and down. And though we may have been in the brokerage business all our lives, at the moment of possible transition, stocks and bonds do not look very important. Other things of a natural, common nature do not look very important. Careers do not look important. Even those most intimate things around us that we have really come to greatly be attached to, our friends, our associates, our home furnishings, all these things are not very important. We perceive that with desperate illness, that the individual sort of retires away from everything that he thought was important. And these various things, departing from him, leave the desperately sick in a wonderful state of acceptance. It no longer occurs to them to struggle particularly. They will either get well or they will not get well. And they realize that they are not as frightened as they thought they were going to be. That after all, it isn't as important as it looked when they were in good health. When, as Omar says, a single aleph divides the false and true, or this world and the next, the barrier is very thin, and which world we're going to land in does not seem to be terribly important anymore. 6 weeks later, we wonder how we could feel that way because we're getting strong again. But in the moment when we are really sick, there is a tremendous tendency of the individual to simply submerge or introvert into a kind of indifferent quietude. Perhaps pain may disturb it. But all in all, even pain cannot change this basic sense that all these tremendously interesting things are not interesting anymore. Even getting well is not very interesting. It is only after we pass the crisis and begin to feel better that we are even interested in getting well. Now, man doesn't always have these experiences totally on a physical plane. He has them on numerous levels, and emergencies in life, as they form into various patterns, are met with two kinds of reactions. One is resistance and belligerence, and the other is a gradually simplifying acceptance. Now, if this acceptance reaches a certain degree of totality, we find that the individual in that moment has his greatest possible probability of recovery. He will recover when he stops fighting. Now, everyone says, of course, that when we don't care whether we live or not, then we probably won't. They want us to fight. But technically, the fighting isn't what does it. It is not the fighting, it is the peculiar state of the consciousness at the moment when this supposed fighting takes place. And if that consciousness simply takes a very simple position, one which it can never and does never define, but which is in substance, not my will but thine be done, something is released. For that moment, the individual is free. And the moment he is free, he is available. And thus it becomes that man's emergency is God's opportunity. It becomes inevitably the fact that in this state of suspension of polarities, very often most wonderful and incredible things happen. These things seemingly reminding us that to the degree illusion weakens in us, ever-present reality moves in upon us. Or rather, more correctly, we move into it. And Buddha's concept of the nirvana, which results from the complete extinction of the fires of excessive egoism in man, this attainment is conditionally possible through this relaxation in faith. Thus, in the moment of faith, in the moment of simple acceptance, man achieves the closest relationship that he can possibly attain with cause, with the dynamic, eternal root of his own being. In that instant, he may have the experience of cause. And what we call a miracle is therefore a form of the so-called mystical experience. The miracle is the release through man of another kind of energy. It is the nearest thing that we know to causal energy. It seems as if this hard core of reality speaks again. And it only speaks when all other voices are silent. It only speaks when man himself stops talking, whether it be in words or thoughts, emotions or actions. But in the complete suspension, or almost complete disassociation of man from his objectivity, when he is suspended in the aloneness, when he recognizes his total inability to extricate himself from any situation, he is the nearest to solution. Because in that complete letting go, that complete releasing, he becomes completely receptive. And in that instant, the flash of energy, the complete or most complete release of energy of which man is capable, takes place. This energy moving in re-energizes all of the related fields, passing through the mental, emotional, vital, and physical energy fields, all of which have been brought into a suspension. It apparently recharges these fields from its own causality. It does so because in this tipping of consciousness, man makes his fields negative and allows the positivity of reality itself to flow through them or into them. The problem is a difficult one to put into words, but we know that it is as though a catharsis occurs in the psyche of the person, a complete washing by a blast or blaze of superior power. A superior power that must be or was similar to that which we record of Jesus at the Transfiguration, or the power that we also recognize, this magnificent blaze of celestial splendor at the illumination of Buddha. It is the complete release of the potential, moving and inevitably cleansing that through which it passes, like a water of life released from the heavens above. But what this really is simply man's true baptism in the water of reality. It is this mysterious and wonderful cleansing thing that is referred to as the cleansing blood of Golgotha. It is also the cleansing water of the baptism of the Spirit. This is what comes to those who are washed by this life or light within themselves. We have many rather crude parallels in old hymns and old stories of this idea, the blood of the Lamb, and that we shall be washed until we are whiter than snow, and all these things that made very little sense. And yet some way, mysteriously, there is a sense within them and behind them. And that sense is this tremendous cleansing power of pure consciousness. This unconditioned and unrestricted flow of reality. Now, man cannot sustain it. He cannot sustain it any more than he could sustain total reality. If it should take up its abode in him, it would certainly destroy him by its own effulgency. It is more than body can hold within this slender cup with which we have been equipped or endowed. So these things generally happen in the form of a flash. Bamey calls it the lightning flash. The tremendous and sudden awareness of a total security, a total reality. Now I'm inclined to suspect that this peculiar, what the modern psychologist would call an acausal factor, because he just doesn't like to play with the word God, he's afraid of it. But this acausal factor is the reason for the psychological change that follows. I do not think that the psyche itself, or the psychological integration of the individual, is the total cause of a miracle. In other words, I don't believe that it arises in the mental or emotional fields of energy. But the miracle becomes, as in the great dispute in the church, becomes the seal, the sign, the symbol, the authority, the validity for a change in nature or being. Having experienced this as a fact within self, the individual then gains certain insight, or can gain certain faith, greatly strengthened, gains a certain knowledge or participation in a superior thing. And this in turn has a dynamic effect upon the future state of himself. Impersonality, unselfishness, these are the emotions, if any, which are associated with this problem. You may have read the rather recent account of the unbeliever, the young communist at Lourdes, who did not believe that miracles were possible. He was ill and was finally lured to go there. Nothing else seemed possible. He had no faith and admitted it. While he was there, he saw this desperately sick child, its face lighted with radiance, hoping, praying for deliverance. And this rather flea-bitten, hard-hearted, and hard-headed unbeliever had a moment in himself that was hard for him to live with. But actually, we are indoctrinated from the outside, but our vital integration comes from inside. So this man, looking at this faith-filled child, hoping so desperately for healing, for a very long, enduring, and terrible difficulty, this man said to himself, well, if there is a God, and there is a healing, never mind me, take care of that child. And he got well. Now that was the point. This man suddenly broke a pattern. And your miracle is nearly always this cracking of a pattern. In that moment, something came through that man that was more universal than his ordinary way of life. It was Bamy's lightning flash. It was something that, because of its intensity and because its vibration was totally contrary to the magnetic fields that he had previously built up, this thing shattered a pattern. And because it was greater, it could shatter. And because it did shatter through this moment of total unselfishness, this man had an experience which undoubtedly changed his life. It was the experience of the tremendous release of self through selflessness. How it happened, many will try to explain. But the answer, when we study it, is the vibratory change in these fields. The miracle, therefore, is the perfectly reasonable result of the establishment of a cause capable of producing miraculous good. The miracle is simply the immediate and inevitable availability of the presence of God. It is this something which, whether we believe God to be a person, a being, an energy, a force, a power, or a mind, that this power, this mind, this being, this total state of life is never more distant from man than his own ignorance, than his own self-will, and the negation which he sets up in his own consciousness. Now, it's not possible to break down this negation by simply saying we want to. Nor is it always possible to break it down through prayer, because prayer may be only a routine statement of words. Prayer may also be half faith and half doubt. Prayer may be only an intellectual and emotional concept, not deep enough to strike into the root of our being. But you will find the case of the individual who, under tremendous pressure of necessity, performs a prodigious feat, something that he cannot do under normal conditions. Such things are not unknown or particularly rare. Weak people have shown incredible physical strength. Comparatively ignorant people have suddenly had a flash of knowledge for a particular need that was very great. Very simple people have had incredible internal security under certain conditions. And these conditions all remind us of this extra factor, this factor that can break through, reminding us that this universe that we know about is suspended, indeed, from a splendid center, from a magnificent overbeing, and that the life of this overbeing is everywhere present, and that it can be interpreted in one moment as sunshine, in another moment as nutrition. It may be captured in a vitamin. It may be released through the flower that grows in the field. It may come to us in a magnificent piece of music or in a flash of light within ourselves. It is always this something more than our ordinary selves. And if we believe in evolution, we can believe also that this something more is not merely some strange super force, that this something more is a part of our own complete economy toward which we are growing, And as growth brings us nearer to it, all these wonderful and miraculous things become obviously natural and normal things. And when man, through a proper attitude, holds these constructive principles within himself, he enjoys in his daily living those natural rewards which now come through an exceptional circumstance. Therefore, the mystic would affirm that the miracle is the result of a moment's or a second of attunement, or at one-ment, between the creature and the Creator, between man's limited state and the unlimited potential of universal being. That therefore, this miracle is merely reality, asserting itself for an instant in the confused pattern of mankind. And because it is reality, it sets this pattern instantly into the likeness of itself. Now this pattern normally wants to take that likeness. The impulse of all patterns in nature is toward realities, toward fact. The snowflake crystallizing never fails to take the pattern which is geometrically suited to its own nature. Everything in man, everything in the universe, naturally wishes to follow the laws of its kind. Man, by his peculiar machinations, makes this difficult for himself. He is forever forcing patterns out of symmetry. The only time when he's really kind to himself is when he's asleep. Then he gives that little bit of relaxation which permits the body to recover in part from the indiscretions of the mind and emotions. Actually, however, these patterns in man, if not arbitrarily forced into variance with law, will fall into law, will abide by it, and immediately becoming adjusted to it will receive the full benefit of its presence. These patterns then find themselves substantiated magnificently from within themselves by the various energies which are natural to them. If, therefore, under certain circumstances, man is capable of adjusting his consciousness to this magnificent energy field of being, this great reality field, immediately every atom of his own being falls into that pattern, because it is its own. It is the thing that it has always really been. It's the thing it has always longed to return to. It is not an artificial thing which must be achieved. It is an inevitable thing which must be affirmed only, and the fact itself is there. So under those conditions there is very little conflict the moment man steps aside. And in those instants, then, tremendous vitalizations take place, leaving imperishable records upon the objective consciousness of man. The miracle, therefore, becomes an inducement, an inspiration toward the continuance of those conditions by which it is produced. Once man has known or experienced this ineffable mystery within his own nature, even in part, he becomes convinced in a new kind of way, a living conviction, that there are these forces. He is therefore inclined to desire to obey them, to become more aware of them. And he discovers his basic relationship with the universe, which is the relationship of quietude, the relationship of being still and permitting these wonderful powers to be known in him. Thus, practically all of our difficulties in life are due to this inability to be still, this inability to relax to reality. All tension is sickness. Relaxation to reality must ultimately be the key not only to recovery but to the prevention of sickness. For if man keeps the law, he will not be sick. If having broken the law, he reaffirms it, returning to it as the penitent, accepting the law as reality, then such repair as is possible under the conditions will almost certainly come to him. And the greater the degree of his conscious statement of the law through the simplest of all actions, natural, quiet faith. The more complete this is, the more complete the therapy will become. We know this from observing many cases and watching the records of religion and philosophy and the great healing shrines and temples of the world from the beginning. They are in every instance a statement of man's acceptance of the availability of the universal power of health. And this power of health is the power of well-being. And well-being, to manifest itself, must first of all cause man to experience the need of well-being. The need of this inner security as superior to and greater than any other consideration in his life. Emergency forces him to this statement. And in this emergency, he discovers the greatest and most powerful message that the world can possibly give him. Well, this emergency is also an archetype of the whole process of growth. For man seeking to unfold his ultimate potential through evolution, through knowledge, through wisdom, through the quest and seeking for all things good and true, man seeking these ends is actually working, as Plato so well points out, along roads of wisdom, only that he may find faith. That in finding faith, he perfects wisdom, perfects the works of wisdom. The wise are seeking, the faithful have found. And those who have this faith find that its effect upon their chemical integration is extraordinary. That it begins immediately to repair that which is broken down or injured. And of course, it also prevents other action contrary to law, and therefore diminishes the probability of further sickness or disaster. So this is more or less the philosophical summary of the concept. And I think it has many points in it which will be valuable in the contemplation of the miracle, which is the miraculous power of man to accept the simple fact of God. And until man has this miraculous change in himself, he must endure things which would otherwise not be necessary to him. As someone also has pointed out, that is the greater miracle of all is that man does not realize this. And having experienced it traditionally and historically, does not sense that in this simple quietude within himself lies the answer to his every question, the solution to his every need, and the end of all his seeking. For everything that man desires, requires, or really wants will be consummated in the gentleness of quietude and faith. For in these things, if first they are sought, all other things will be added to them. And in this realization, the miracle begins to reveal itself as the eternal, stating itself when man gives it a chance. And while that does not by any means exhaust the philosophy of the subject, I think it gives us certain directions in which to think. Now I think our time is up for this evening.